Hi, I'm Adam Simmons with Project Geospatial and the host of the Geospatial Frontier. I want to welcome you all to our Advances in Commercial GEOINT panel. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the moderator for this session, Mr. Robert Zitz. With over 40 years of experience in government and industry, Mr. Zitz is widely regarded as a visionary with technical and political arena, turning concepts into reality. He is an expert in the fields of GEOINT, intelligence satellites, multi-int, and open source analytics. Before joining the industry, he was an intelligence community veteran who rose from the rank of entry-level intelligence analyst to SES-6 and Deputy Undersecretary. Mr. Zitz's executive experience spans Army intelligence, CIA, NGA, DHS, Secret Service, and the NRO. Mr. Zitz is currently the president of Robert Zitz and Associates, LLC. He advises companies and the U.S. government agencies involved in defense, intelligence, and homeland security missions, and has a record of business growth and mission success. And now, our moderator, Mr. Rob Zitz, will introduce our panelists and start the discussion.
Adam, thanks a lot for that introduction, and thanks you for this series of panels. I understand we're the first, or we're happy to set the bar high for all the other panels to follow us. I'm really proud today to be able to introduce to the audience three luminaries in the remote sensing world, and I'll get to their bios in a second, but I wanted to do a short stage setter for everybody about what we intend to talk about today. You know, if you're dialing into this or you're watching this, you're either somebody who's already got an interest in remote sensing. You may be a customer, you may be in the business, you may be somebody who's just curious about science and technology. But those of us who have been living this understand that there have been some significant things that have happened both geopolitically and with technology over the last couple of decades that have really led us to where we are today. Because the remote sensing work is, of course, very important for the very fabric of societies, not only here, but around the world, and becoming even more important as we look at location services and the various things that people have become accustomed to from remote sensing. But in the government worlds and in defense and intelligence, it's become an imperative. And we'll touch on that as well today, too, because we grew up over the last many decades in an environment where the realm of space and doing remote sensing, and particularly very significant and very exquisite remote sensing from space, was something that typically only governments could do and only governments could afford to do. That's really changed, and we'll delve into that some here today. And in fact, the other thing that's occurred over especially the last 20 years, from a geopolitical standpoint, we know now, and you'll see many of the leaders of the U.S. government talking about the fact that space is no longer a sanctuary. And that means that the assets that we have as a nation that we rely upon, not only for defense and for intelligence, but for other uses, including commercial uses. And again, as I said, society itself depends on this, that these things may be at risk. And so more and more we're hearing senior leadership in the U.S. government and allied governments talk about the need for resilience. And they also talk about the need for persistence. So those things we'll talk about. And in many U.S. government leaders' minds, what that means is that in order to afford having more systems to be able to see and hear more about what's going on, in order to afford to do that, we have to do it in a different way. We just can't afford an unlimited number of exquisite satellites that have extraordinary price tags. So commercial remote sensing has grown over time from augmenting primarily for mapping and charting type of information to now being viewed by many in governments as a necessary and important extension of their own government-owned and government-operated systems. So we'll get into that as well. But the satellites themselves, the collection systems, that's only really a small part of the story, because the real need, whether you're talking about a warfighter or you're talking about somebody in the financial sector or energy sector, what they really need is information, and they need that information and time to do something with it. We'll talk about that too, because I'm sure that each of these panelists will describe their work and their companies as about providing information and not just signals or pixels. So with that, let me first do a very brief introduction of our distinguished panelists. The way we'll handle the format today is I'll introduce each of them, then they'll each have a few moments to give you some information about what they're up to now, the companies that they're involved with now, and where they see that headed. And then we're going to really have a discussion. We're not going to have just a series of statements with a couple of minutes at the end for questions and answers. What I'd like to try to do is stir the pot a little bit and get these experts who've been in the business for so long to talk to each other and to me and to the audience about some of the key things that are going on, some of the challenges, the good, the bad, and even in some cases the ugly. But whenever we talk about a challenge, we'll talk about a potential solution. So first, let me start with Bill Shuster. Bill Shuster is consultant and co-founder of HighSpec IQ. HighSpec IQ, as the name would imply, is about hyperspectral collection. Bill's a 22-year veteran with the Central Intelligence Agency. He was a vice president at Loral Space and Range Systems. He was also a vice president at Harris Corporation. He's been a president of Integrated Systems at BAE. He was also the chief operating officer at GEOINT. Along with Bill on the panel is Scott Herman. Scott is the chief technology officer of Black Sky Global. Scott spent much of his career supporting the intelligence community and military intelligence customers. Scott has been with TRW. He was with GTE, L3, Logicon. He was the chief information officer at Web Methods. He was a vice president at Visual CV, and he was a vice president at GEOINT. Last but not least is Mike Moran. Mike is the chief operating officer at Prentiss Corporation. He's spent 26 years in the Air Force, retiring as a colonel, a variety of leadership positions in the space arena, both in Space Command, the National Reconnaissance Office, in DoD positions, and NATO positions as well. His prior assignment was as vice president for space strategies at Peraton. So let me first start with you, Mike. Can you tell us a little bit more about Prentiss, sort of set the stage about what you're doing and where you're headed?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for the introduction, Rob. And thanks as well to the Project Geospatial team and the forum, as well as to our URSA sponsors, Adam and Julie. It's a treat to be at least virtually on the same page with Bill and Scott, a special opportunity, a great privilege, so thank you for that. It's, as you described, a perfect time to talk about challenges in our market, and as always, a great opportunity for me to share a little bit by way of introduction of Prentiss Corporation as one of the newest entrants into the remote sensing family. So a bit about Prentiss, founded last year. Prentiss is building and will operate the world's largest and most advanced commercial synthetic aperture radar constellation. Our focus, as you might imagine, is delivering unprecedented image quality, global persistence, as you mentioned, Rob, and rapid data delivery that meets the needs of both our government as well as commercial customers, and enhances the missions and the business outcomes that they're seeking to employ. As a company, we're really fortunate to have the benefit of a terrific leadership team led by our CEO, Major General Roger Teague. Many of you and in the audience know Roger, who brings really an extensive and distinguished career in the space community. And he's assembled a top-tier technical and business team to support him and our many mission customers. We're also very fortunate to have a super board of directors. They similarly bring amazing space domain and military expertise, but it's coupled with a tremendous access to market capital. And it's really the combination of those that really ensures Prentiss can deliver our commitments successfully. Technical expertise, mission customer domain awareness, and market capital, I think are keys to success. As always, as we all know, accelerating our time to market is always key. To that end, Prentiss is very fortunate to have the advantage of flight-proven satellite platforms provided by our sister company, Tyvak Nanosatellite Systems. So we're in the business of combining that mature orbital platform with our advanced radar payload. And now with ever more affordable and available launch opportunities, we think we can move extremely quickly to bring U.S. commercial innovation in synthetic aperture radar to our customers and help contribute to the mission challenges ahead. I'm also very excited, Rob. Today, there's a special announcement. Prentiss today announced that we'll launch a 48 spacecraft constellation with our first launch next year. So we're very, very excited. Within that constellation, we'll deploy spacecraft into multiple orbits. They're optimized to satisfy the needs of both our U.S. government and commercial customers so that we can provide the data from which all those mission outcomes are real. So we're very, very excited at Prentiss. And I think that excitement really permeates the whole of our geospatial community. As you described, a whole host of geopolitical challenges of the day. There are many, but I think so too are U.S. commercial advanced technology opportunities. So I think it's a terrific time to be part of the community as we step forward. U.S. commercial leadership in GEOINT is critical to our nation and to our community. And I think we're on the precipice of really some fundamental rapid delivery of a next generation capability. So look forward to the panel. Thanks for the introduction.
Mike, thanks for that. And your work on SAR really is emblematic of the title of the panel today, which is Advances in Commercial GEOINT, because as we know, it's been quite a while. I mean, there were policy barriers to get to being able to collect high quality radar, and we'll get more into that. And so speaking of advances, Scott Herman from Black Sky, could you talk to us about what's happening at Black Sky and where you're headed?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everybody. I'm Scott Herman, and I'm the CTO at Black Sky. And Rob, thanks for moderating the panel, and Adam and Project Geospatial for the invitation. If you haven't run into Black Sky before, we're a global monitoring company. And what I mean is we pull in observations from the world's sensor networks, and we do activity monitoring and site and facility monitoring for our customers, which are primarily in the U.S. and international defense and intelligence space. We pull in data from space, from the air, from environmental sensors, from industrial IoT, from a wide range of narrative sources. But really the most important source of data that we're feeding into our analytics system actually comes from our own growing constellation of Earth observation satellites. We are a very important part of the small sat revolution. We are a low Earth orbiting small sat platform flying in inclined orbits, which gives us some really interesting differentiators from more traditional concepts of remote sensing, including things like very high revisit throughout the day, intraday revisit, which means we're capturing images at dawn and at dusk, as well as kind of the middle of the day. And we're really focused on things like site monitoring and how do you build pattern of life analytics against that. We actually have 2 more satellites going up in just a few days, so early next week, fingers crossed, right? We'll be launching on a SpaceX mission out of Kennedy on probably Monday or Tuesday of next week, depending on how the schedule and the weather works out. We've really been at this kind of nexus of several different revolutions that are going on. There's a revolution in terms of low-cost satellite assembly through commercial components, standardization, cheaper launch, getting to space cost effectively, allowing startups to start thinking about access to space. You don't have to be a large aerospace contractor or have a giant government subsidy to be able to do this. We're actually doing this as a commercial offering funded through venture capital and funded through institutional investors as much as anything else. And then, of course, we're kind of combining that with what we can do around geospatial analytics to kind of exploit and bring more meaning to the imagery. We're not simply delivering pixels. So when you think about Black Sky, think about it from the perspective of a global monitoring mission, but our constellation is the premium source of fuel for that global monitoring engine.
Thanks a lot. And as we dive into it, one of the things I'm sure people will be interested in is, because you're doing electro-optical, what's different about what you're doing as we go forward. We'll come back to that, including direct downlink and the ability to really shorten the timelines from space to the hands of an end user. Bill, you were at the outset, and we'll hear about what you're up to now, but be thinking ahead now, because we're going to come back after you to both you and Scott to talk about that was then and this is now regarding GEOI and today, what each of you are doing today. So, Bill Shuster.
Hi, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it being on this panel. HySpec has spent the last several years interfacing with various market segments, looking at needs that could be serviced by remote sensing. These included agriculture, oil and gas, mining, insurance, defense and intel, environmental, and a number of others. Turns out the results of those discussions indicated that hyperspectral and what it could do came to a forefront, and it was really an underserviced need with a potential benefit to multiple market segments. What exists today are aircraft with the resolution needed to meaningfully address some of the issues that hyperspectral can serve, but the aircraft don't have the broad access. And the other thing you have is satellites that have the access but don't have the resolution. The opportunity is ripe, but only viable to the broader user community if its applications can be simpler than hyperspectral utilization is today, which often requires spectral scientists engaged in the actual day-to-day operations. Also, HSI, hyperspectral information alone, can't answer all the questions, but it can unlock the true meaning of what's being observed by others and what other different modalities get to see. All of that formed the basis for what HySpec IQ is working on, which is a high-resolution hyperspectral satellite-based system with a production and analytics back end to make it user-friendly and interoperable with data from collection platforms which have different modalities. And hopefully we'll speak about that since we've got different modalities here on the panel. The technical performance of the system is one criteria of success, and the others are the programmatic in nature. The first of those programmatic ones is system cost. Despite a brief foray with a larger format and very expensive satellite, HySpec IQ is focused on a relatively low-cost solution. This mandated a smaller size spacecraft, maximizing off-the-shelf commercial hardware, and use of some very innovative technologies. The second is time to market, which was also mentioned by one of the earlier colleagues. There is a conflict between risk and speed. HySpec IQ has elected a path that balances these competing demands. To mitigate risk, HySpec IQ will first build and fly its sensor on an airborne platform. This will allow us to validate the design and its utility. In parallel with this, HySpec IQ will be space qualifying that new technology I mentioned by running a payload through a full environmental set of environmentals, including vibe, thermal vac, and the associated environments. All of that will take place next year. Or it's taking place this year, it will culminate next year. A benefit of the technology I've been speaking about, besides its performance, is that its cost and time to manufacture is substantially less than traditional methods, reducing a critical path item from what usually takes a couple of years to just several months. This allows the first satellite launch less than 16 months following the aerial demo. The initial launch will be followed by others as we build out the constellation to attain the capacity and the timeliness that's required by the markets. We have ample funding and are moving ahead in both the technical arena and the market interaction. And probably I'll end it there and we can talk about other things as we move forward.
Well, thanks a lot for that, Bill. And really a question for all three of you then. I want to delve into this that was then, this is now a little bit. I think Mike and I were both still in government when you guys headed down a path to what ultimately became GEOI and then Digital Globe. But remember in 2013, when sequestration hit, we had gotten up to quite a sizable amount of money each year being spent on remote sensing by the US government. We hit sequestration, and all the rhetoric about how that was going to be an important part of the future. It was obviously necessary for geospatial information for the military and planning and mapping and so on. When we hit that sequestration wall, we remember that that caused a cliff and dollars were taken from that. That makes me come to the point that each one of you, unless you're a billionaire in your own right, has had to go to private equity or to venture capital in order to get dollars to build it out, to have a business case that's a viable business case that someone would say, yes, I see the need. I see your plan is feasible. I'll invest. Could you, the three of you, sort of talk about how you characterize to your investors the changes that have occurred from back in the early days of remote sensing, when it was really very much focused on augmenting national technical means, to where we are now, and the three companies have been successful in raising dollars. What's different from then to now?
I guess, Rob, if I may take a cut at that, the one thing I took away as a lesson learned is that you can't depend on a single contract or a single anchor tenancy as your business case. And so what we've done, and as I mentioned earlier, we've based this around a customer and our markets, and it was not because they were in alphabetical order. In fact, they were in the order that I thought about them. And you notice that the government stuff was later on in my list of applications and markets that we spoke to. So what I think from our perspective, we're trying to build a broad constituency and to operate on a purely commercial basis without what Scott mentioned as a I forgot the word, but a subsidy from the U.S. government, and without depending on any single market as being the solution, the thing that keeps the business afloat.
So what do you think about that, Mike and Scott? I hear, and the people on this listening in today and watching today, they go to conferences, they attend events, they hear commercial companies talk about how we're a commercial concern. But isn't it true that having at least to study dollars or interest or even small contracts from the U.S. government sends a signal to venture capitalists and private equity, or am I overstating that?
No, Rob, this is Mike. I think it's not one of these this or that. It's really a both. I think the capital market gets confidence from how broad the customer base is and how they've shown confidence and commitments to those. We're very fortunate to have both commitments in the government and commercial space, as well as a eager investor class. But it's also the government team being confident that they're not the one left holding the bag at the end of a mission space. They really need to know that it is a broad, capable enterprise. And I think that's one of the early touch points for the government, really getting confident that the venture capital investments are there sufficient to get over the capital hump and start delivering and sustaining capabilities. So we've been very fortunate to see sort of both of those sides. And I think the intersection now of technologies whose form factor are small enough to be operationally meaningful to the different customer bases that are served, and the maturity of those with low risk elements, proven small satellite. And by small, it's not always, grapefruit small satellite, as I think we started out in the first CubeSat, and we were all going, our technology, no way. But now the technology is getting far, but also the small satellite form factor itself has gotten large enough with rideshare capabilities that it can be, 350, 500 kilogram and still be small rideshare to gain the benefits there. But in something like SAR, where you need real power and size to matter, you can still fit in small satellite form factors while delivering highly capable solutions. And I think our customer base and our investor base are seeing that, and that's a powerful shift and revolution for us.
How about you, Scott?
Yeah, I would come at it a little bit from your question around what do we tell investors, and it's investors and customers, and what's kind of different now. We talk about things in terms of revenue that can come from a larger addressable market, and we talk about cost of goods sold. What does it cost to actually produce the information that we're providing? We love anchor customers, and we hope to have deep relationships with the U.S. government and allied governments. But we're also looking beyond that to a much broader range of customers. You know, we've seen yet another revolution going on right now, which is the mainstreaming of geospatial data for lots and lots of different use cases. And so when we talk to investors, that's one of the things they're very interested in. It's, you know, what is your relationship with the U.S. government? But then where do you go from there? We love anchor customers, but we're not solely dependent upon anchor customers. And then the COGS question, the cost of goods sold, really gets into what does it take to build a satellite constellation? What does it take to build an analytics platform? And historically, you know, you were talking about billion-dollar investments per satellite, 7 to 15-year waterfall engineering efforts. Now it's all about a college lab bench and commercial off-the-shelf components and cheap rideshare launch or cheaper launch platforms that are coming out of the woodwork. And those all contribute to an ability to offer product at volume at cheaper cost into new addressable markets. And I think that's what gets the venture capital and the private equity markets very excited. I think the other thing that I would add is that the use cases themselves have changed a little bit as well. You know, traditionally commercial remote sensing was really about supporting foundation missions. You know, think about it, mapping missions. You know, what do we know about the world in some static period of time? And it was used much less for things like monitoring. And what we're doing is building a capability that gives us a routine monitoring capability. It's almost like drones in space, right? It's an ISR type capability, except you have the benefits of overhead. And what that allows us to do is take advantage of things like high revisit, intraday collection, low latency, direct downlink, but giving you some level of persistence over a target that allows you to start determining what is the op tempo of activities at that facility or at that location, which allows you to derive pattern of life. And pattern of life and the derivation of anomalies in that pattern of life make this a very different place than let's map the world for foundation missions.
Yeah, so that's interesting. As you talk about, it's not either or, it's both U.S. government as well as commercial. Of course, well, I think we're all relatively same age group where we sort of grew up where there was a 10-meter rule and you couldn't collect anything better or a better resolution than 10 meters. That shows how old we've gotten to where we are today. But like I alluded to earlier, there was a concern about operational security and concern about radar because it's all day, all night, all weather. Hyperspectral, LIDAR, SWIR, these things have been kind of a hard road to hoe to get to where we are now. However, Department of Commerce's recent rule has enabled people to go to market much more, I'll say, readily if other countries have already fielded some of these technologies. As you guys look at the changes that are occurring, both with Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, the intelligence community, do you see goodness, but do you also see impediments? Because, of course, you know, there are going to be limits to what you could sell, particularly we're talking advanced commercial GEOINT here. This is not your father's Oldsmobile, just black and white. You know, we're talking about capabilities among the three companies here that may make some people nervous in the intelligence community. Should you comment on that and how you're navigating that? Any of you?
Yeah, sure, Rob. As Mike, I'll hop in. So I'm very encouraged by the changes in the regulatory regime. I think that's very forward-looking. I think it really helps U.S. competitiveness globally, and based on that, I think it will enrich the U.S. market with human capital in the area, and a proliferation of capabilities and companies that can contribute. That said, we're a U.S.-owned, U.S.-controlled company. We care deeply and passionately about the security of our nation and our forces. And so we recognize there are very legitimate and important constraints that we fully intend to comply and will comply with. But we think that there are good business cases that can still be supported. Certainly bringing our technology to the benefit of U.S. government customers is foremost in our minds, and our technology quickly getting there. But I think the process and the opportunities with 24/7 all-weather persistent comes some very reasonable constraints and limitations that we're ready to help support solutions for.
Yeah, I'll make a stab at this too. That we've seen the OPSEC discussion change. It's still extremely important. Any of our interactions with the U.S. government or allied governments talks about the OPSEC issues in using commercial GEOINT in general, not just commercial satellite imagery. But the discussion has changed, and it's not so much about what can you see and what is your resolution, and almost a fear factor around the phenomenology. The discussion has become much more around ConOps and tradecraft, and what kind of problems can you chase using commercial data, and how do you secure and not give away your mission, basically. But that's a very different discussion than just, your instruments are too precise and therefore thou shalt not be allowed to use them. It's a more nuanced discussion now. There's certainly many, many different camps and different religious wars going on around OPSEC and the use of commercial assets. Organizations like Special Operations really like it because it's easily shareable, right? It's the old, I can take this image to the tribal leader and he can tell me where the bad guys went, as opposed to it being constrained in a skiff where you can't get it to anybody. But it's still very much an issue. It's impacting tradecraft and methodology. It's impacting the type of data and the tools that you can use in working in unclassified environments. It impacts dissemination and production of that intelligence. And then it also impacts, what do you do with the data once you have it? If you're a U.S. intelligence agency or a defense consumer, at some point you want to get it back into your high side environment where all the work happens. And so that issue of, how is it transferred? When is it transferred? How do you secure those transferred? Is a very important part of the OPSEC discussion. It's not simply, I'm working solely on the outside or not. It's a holistic approach around all those different factors.
Scott introduced an interesting idea that stepped away from the Department of Commerce regulation of the commercial remote sensing industry into, he was talking about, I think, about how you interact with the security of the user and their concerns about OPSEC, which is different than what the policy, the one policy is. I want to introduce a third thought, which says you may have asked the question with what you had in mind being the Department of Commerce thing, which I think the attitude and the tenor of the whole discussion has changed, and changed very favorably into trying to work in a very constructive way, as opposed to a rigid and not very agile way. I think that has improved markedly. I think that it's a case-by-case basis to deal with, I think, the point Scott made, which is interacting with the OPSEC and the security beyond the policy issues. The one that I want to introduce is that still is a thorn in my side, which is ITAR, which you might not have had in mind at all, but in fact, it greatly affects what you can do and how you and where you can do it, or the ease with which you could do it, with regards to commercial remote sensing, putting ground stations in other countries. I mean, I have war stories that are too long to go into, but I have to tell one. If you have a system that's been deemed an ITAR system, and a part fails in that, and let's just for argument's sake that part is a off-the-shelf commercial laptop, you can't supply that laptop. You have to go through the ITAR process, even though you could tell the person to go out and buy the laptop because it's readily available. You can't furnish it as a contractor as a replacement part. And there's a whole series of little silliness like that makes it difficult or challenging to operate in a commercial environment, in the international global environment. And it also is viewed as harassment in some cases by commercial customers, particularly government commercial, foreign government customers. And so I think that I like what I see in the Department of Commerce. I won't really comment on Scott's thing. I mean, I think it's working, and you just got to figure it out. But ITAR is an area that I haven't seen positive movement in, and I think it really does affect us.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a good segue to something that I wanted to bring up now, which is sort of the multi-phenomenology, multi-ent, all source, open source integration, and whatever terminology you choose to use. Because, ITAR in its most extreme could be read to say if you've got a new tradecraft, a new approach of melding different piece parts together, even that could be a concern. I know, Bill, you'd brought up earlier on when you introduced your company, the idea of multi-phenomenology. Let's talk about that for a second, because from a radar standpoint, if you think about radar and EO working together to do persistence, I can't imagine what would provide more persistence than rapid revisit off hours collection from a black sky global tied to Prentiss, where you're getting all day, all night, all weather. I like to tell people, what's not to love about EO except that it's 62% cloud cover daily average, except where we care, where it's 90% cloud cover. When I say that, I know the black sky guys grimace a little bit, but can you talk about each of you, and of course, Bill, you inherently with a hyperspectral sensor, you're going to be having partnerships and teaming arrangements and looking for ways to meld other data together with what you're doing with hyperspectral. Can the three of you talk about your thoughts on that? I mean, what are you doing already? How are you thinking about that? How are you going to meld other data with what you're planning to bring to the party?
One of the things that we're doing, I told you, we're speaking to different markets, is working on use cases and looking at what we bring to the party, and do we have a value proposition that says that we're worthwhile to employ. Some of those use cases show much higher benefit, greater value proposition when you combine hyperspectral with radar, or you combine it with multispectral. One quick illustration is that multispectral may be able to tell whether a particular crop is healthy or not. Hyperspectral tells you what it is that's wrong. That's just a simple illustration. There's lots of those kinds of illustrations of things that you might see with radar, might not. And so we view it as an inherent part of our program and look, to future collaborations where we're working some of the use cases, but we don't produce radar. So if you want to combine radar and hyperspectral, you got to go get radar. And likewise, a radar guy may want hyperspectral to answer some problems that they have, and we need to figure out how we make that work.
Yeah, so multi-source or multi-phenomenology is really integral to our approach to global monitoring. And we think about how our EO constellation kind of fits into this larger spectrum of capabilities that support a global monitoring mission. And the particular thing I want to talk about is tipping and queuing, and how we view the sensor networks that are out there, including all these startups, including legacy systems, including national or defense systems, into a larger ecosystem. A lot of times people ask us, like, it's a zero-sum game, right? Aren't you fighting all these guys? And it's like, no, we are trying to figure out how we all complement each other. And let me give you some examples. The constellation we're building is really around activity or facility monitoring, right, through high revisit, high resolution EO imagery. But how do we know what to shoot? Well, we pull in data from lots of different sources. We may pull in radio frequency information from like a Hawkeye 360 or a Cleos. We may pull in cell phone telemetry data showing us where different intensities of populations may be interacting at a new construction site, for example. We pull in narrative data. What are the latest, Russian military journals telling us about aircraft deployments at particular facilities? So we pull data in from a lot of different sources to create the tips that then can automatically cue our satellites to go start a monitoring regimen against that facility. Now we start building up a stack of imagery against that facility, looking for op-tempo and anomalies. And now we can spend a silver bullet with some of the more exquisite sensors that have, very competitive demands put against them. So think about it as a spectrum, right? We take tips from lots of different phenomenology. We use that to zero in and monitor activity. And then when we need to take a closer look, we call out to SAR or hyperspectral or super high resolution optical. Or in some cases, we'll cycle back to some of those original sources and tip them in, instead of a linear kind of a TC-PED, sequential flow. It becomes this constant, gratuitous feedback loop where something is tipping us from one area, and then we go and tip, or we go and task in another area, and then kind of blend that together with our overall monitoring regimen that we're doing with our constellation.
That's great. Mike, what are you guys doing along that line?
Yeah, I think just some great comments all around. I think the days of any single int or any single sensor providing the information that is definitively answering the question of a customer, be it in defense, intelligence, commercial, those days are rapidly waning. There is, however, huge gaps in data sets and data availability that I think certainly, as we talked about, the SAR platform is just a great solution to. So we're very excited about that being part of the ecosystem that is generating data to support solutions. But we also see partnerships as the key. We often talk about competitors, but it's really competimates, and sometimes it's just really U.S. partnership opportunities and international partnership opportunities. The days of having to vertically integrate everything in your value proposition, those slow us, and those create huge capital, and those create actually problems in the hybrid architectures that are ubiquitous in our communities. And I think to the point, providing definitive SAR data sets to complement others is absolutely part of great solutions for our nation and our customers. The challenge of integration is critical. And while it often descends to a technical integration, how does my data get in? How does my data get out? There's really a broader point that both Scott and Bill alluded to, which is the ConOps integration. How do we work together in a hybrid environment to support military, intelligence, commercial customers' needs in an orchestrated manner to really get the power that Prentiss can bring, coupled with the benefits of many other sensors in the mix. So I think that early integration is vital. We at Prentiss are spending a substantial amount of time engaging with our customers now, not just so an investor says, oh, they like Prentiss, that's great, but we really want to make sure that our integration into their concept of operations, that tip and cue can happen easily, because it ensures our data and our information is readily available to solve their hard problems, and therefore generates a much smoother on-ramp to revenue.
That's awesome. And all three of you, I think, are going to depend on tipping and queuing going forward. We're getting questions from the audience about analytics, and that's sort of the next step in melding all these different disparate data together. But before we do that, just let me ask a question. I believe all three, well, Prentiss not yet, but certainly Black Sky and HighSpec IQ received National Reconnaissance Office study awards as they're examining going forward. Look forward to that happening with Prentiss. But at least on the street, the view of it is that's very much a hub and spoke, where it's individual systems where they're talking to one of you or the other of you or the other of you across the different commercial data providers, rather than doing what we've all just talked about, which is how can we have a more interactive capability with tipping and queuing between you all on the commercial unclassified domain I know people are thinking about permeating the classified versus unclassified membrane and being able to do that kind of work. But here I'm talking about encouraging each of your companies to tip and queue across each other, and the government may be stimulating that. Am I over or understating that case? Do you see or hear from folks like the NRO or NGA the desire to have you as companies start to do that, both from a tipping and queuing, but then later as an analytic to provide them services, analytic services? Let's start with, the raw data. Are you hearing that from NRO yet? I'm pretty sure it's an unclassified question.
Number one rule of Fight Club.
Not. I think, the graybeards among us can certainly help continue to encourage that be another part of what they're asking commercial imagery to do. Does anybody have a comment on that? Otherwise, we want to get to what the questions about analytics look like.
Well, Rob, the only comment I would make is that to answer your question explicitly, there has been no out-and-out tasking that says, go tell us how you go do this, or go sit down with somebody and bring us a partner and talk about how you do tipping and queuing or how this all works. Behind the scenes, unofficially, there are people who are talking about, hey, these things got to work together and will come together. So I think the simple answer to your question is no, there hasn't been an official dialogue of that. People are thinking those thoughts, and we as future suppliers need to think about how these things fit within our model in a way that works for both of us. I've had some experience where it didn't work in yesteryear, and that the lessons out of that need to be factored into future arrangements, so you get systems that work for both parties and not one or the other.
Absolutely, and we know, for example, with what Bucky Bateau is doing out at Defense Innovation Unit, and I think one of the things he's doing for Army is called Titan, and there are end users who are thinking about bringing this together. The shift gears, I want to make sure get in front of you a couple of the audience's questions. And one of the questions is about what you're doing in terms of as a service, analytics as a service. Black Sky, I think you have something called Predictive GEOINT platform, and I think it's being Spectra is another example. I'm sure Radar and Hyperspectral are thinking along. Could the three of you talk about where the rubber meets the road, and that is getting the answers in people's hands?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start with that one. So, in some ways, it kind of relates to the last question, and that is, are these capabilities simply to provide raw observational data, or are they providing insights and answers? And certainly for Black Sky's case, our goal is to provide insights and answers around global monitoring, and we use observations from our satellites, pixels, to kind of fuel the analytics that drive those services. And then from a consumption model perspective, we want to offer it as basically SaaS, right? It's a subscription service where, a customer may come in and go, I've got 300 sites worldwide I want to keep an eye on. Some of them are my own facilities. Some of them are adversary or competitor facilities. Maybe some of them are facilities I'm dependent upon, like upstream in a supply chain, or downstream in terms of container ports and airports and things like that. And they'll say, I want to set different cadences against these. And then you go and do routine monitoring on these facilities and flag me, let me know when something interesting happens that I need to pay attention to, the anomaly that I talked about earlier. And we sell that as a subscription service where you basically sign up and you're fed this data stream that you can then load into your own systems to do further exploitation or to mix and match with other sources of data that your organization may have. But absolutely, the consumption model is around a stream of analytic data, whether that be notifications or triggers, or whether it be a deeper set of data along with the interpretive analytics that kind of help you understand contextually what's happening at that particular place or with that particular activity.
Rob, I'll pile in just to complement Scott's great points. When we talk about, speaking of days of old, one analyst looking at one picture, sorting it all out by themselves because there was only so many. Yes, it was burdensome, and yes, you'd get limited data sets, but they were good, and you could sort out and provide some contextual by sophisticated tradecraft. Nowadays, particularly as I look at Prentiss providing tremendous amounts of SAR data, what we've known for a while that you just cannot get through that kind of data to draw out the information that really matters to your mission. And so the kinds of machine learning and AI and multi-int elements that we've talked about for decades as the nirvana for intelligence and other consumers, we're really seeing companies as represented here on the call who are really advancing platforms capable of bringing those things in. So on our Prentiss point, we're very happy to bring to them data sets that help to support that. In many cases, those AI ML type engines need legitimate real data to develop the tools that allow that kind of tempo. But in many cases, they don't have the data. So they're trying to simulate. And so the development of those multi-int platforms is in some respects constrained by the absence of data, particularly, as you alluded to, in weather denied or nighttime environments. So we really do see a strong element of our business case supporting a wide array of platforms, each providing its unique solutions to offer to their customers answers to problems, not just another data set to try to swim through.
And I would echo the point that the panelists have made, as well as saying that in my introductory comments, I mentioned that we need to make it simpler. Making it simpler is that people don't need to roll their own. They state what the problem is. We provide them the answer to the problem. They need monitoring of one sort or another. You provide the monitoring. You don't provide them a ton of raw data that they need to sort through with experts and tools and the like. And so that is a part and parcel of ours, and perhaps as important, if not more important, than a lot of modalities, because it is so challenging and new to be able to exploit, that you need to really leverage your customers and not keep replicating the same level of expertise. There was one customer organization that happened to be that we was speaking to that had a large number of hyperspectral guys, and they said, "Do you know what it takes to manage this group of experts, geniuses?" And what we really want is, I don't care about all of how did you get the answer. Well, I want to know what the answer is, and that's what we want to provide them.
That's a great point. It just wasn't too long ago with radar when people were saying blobology, and look at how far we come there. And it's partly because of the tools that have been put into place. And so that's the great point, Bill. I have another question, which is an extension of the analytics question, and that is in the COVID-19 situation we've been in for the last 3 or 4 months. We've seen, particularly the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, NGA, but others talking about never going back to the old way. There's a new norm, new normal. And part of that in the defense and intelligence world means being able to get to data and being able to use that data and derive answers for your customers if you're an analyst without sitting in a skiff. And I think, I guess, particularly Black Sky has had a role in that. We've seen some press from the Admiral Sharp, who runs NGA, talking about these things. Do you guys see a time now, and maybe this was the impetus, where it will become the new norm, that the kinds of things you're providing will be available to operators and analysts wherever they are, whenever they are, and they won't need to be in some specialized facility?
Well, certainly our data will be unclassified, and will certainly, but that was also true before. The issue is that if it's an adjunct to systems that are classified, that's problematic. And then what's otherwise problematic is OPSEC. So depending on the application, if you're talking about a U.S. defense application, if there are OPSEC issues or some tradecraft issues, those will remain, classified, which maybe make that problematic. The data itself that the three of us have fundamentally is unclassified.
Yeah, so that's where a financial analyst or an agriculture analyst is at an advantage to somebody, let's say, whose typical day is sitting in. They're only receiving, highly classified information sent through their normal networks, and to get to your work, it's a little bit more, or your capability has been in the past a little more kludgy. So I guess another way of asking that question is, do you envision a time where these government customers will have as easy access to your information and your answers as they do to the more highly classified systems data?
Hey, Rob, maybe I'll pile in one point, and it's a bit of a difference from one of the earlier discussions about, but it lends to ConOps integration. As you alluded to, the services used to be, I've got my own, I used to be, part of the Joint Stars program, big airplane, radar, we've got it, thanks. But as near peer competition in space and more globally has reemerged, and the security of those individual assets has become more at risk. I see many of our services and intel community significantly looking at not just, well, should I add in one stream from the one best player that does SAR or whatever, that they're really, if you've got a sensor or system or information set that can help me solve in a denied or contested environment, I'm hearing things like, we're all in as a service. They want to see those. And I think there's a motivation to bring in data sources and bring in platforms that integrate data for a more tactical or regional type problem. So I'm seeing an opening of the interest in bringing unclassified, diverse sensor sets with frequent coverage, persistent coverage that can complement, or in some cases be the only provider, because when the balloon goes up and some set of capabilities are denied, they want to make sure that they're not blind or deaf, that they really have at least something to fight through their needs in that tactical space. And in the case of Prentiss, of course, we're focused on making sure that, that they're never without that, at least one data source. And I know they're, as was mentioned, Titan and some of these other sort of multi-source platforms is wide open. But that's why that early integration, ConOps integration, technical integration, security integration from OPSECs, as well as those sort of low to high, high to low tipping queue challenges, attacking those now will really maximize the benefit for commercial into that market, and definitely benefit them in getting persistent data from at least some useful sources when they most need it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a hybrid. And what I mean by that is that I think a lot of key intelligence questions can be, researched and answered completely in the open. I think there are others where you can do part of that work low side, and then you may have to take it high side for finishing and combining with other data. And then certainly there's a small percentage of problems where it's just never going to leave the skiff, right? And so I think we need to think about our ConOps from those perspectives and our capabilities from those perspectives. We're spending a lot of time right now with some of our intelligence agency customers, helping them adapt to this. Everybody's working from home, but we can't stop watching the world. So what do we do? And, the issues actually aren't as much about commercial capabilities and data and, are the analytics available? Like, the answer to all that is yes. What's getting in the way are things like, well, can I do that on my home computer? Or what are the IT standards that I have to work under? Or if I'm publishing and disseminating, what does that look like if I created that report on the low side? I don't have my full suite of tools and systems like I do on the high side, even though I've been able to answer that particular intelligence question. So I think, the silver lining, I guess, in terms of this COVID crisis is that it's really forcing a lot of these ideas around what does it mean to operate in the open or operate partially in the open, Now we're being forced to do it, and we're finding out more and more about what works and what doesn't work.
Well, that's great, and it's kind of a good way to wrap up here too. Let me start by saying, after 40 plus years in this line of work, I can tell who's gonna continue to thrive and who isn't in the business. And knowing the three companies and knowing what you're going to bring to bear for your customers, both commercial and government, I'm confident that we look forward a year from now, 5 years from now, 25 years from now, the three of you and your firms will have shown the way. I want to thank you today for being the first. We're the first panel of several. Again, thank Adam and thank Project Geospatial for your effort putting this together, and for the audience who listened to us today and sent in questions. All three of these companies are out on the web. You can get to these gentlemen on the web, and I'm sure they'd like to talk to you and tell you more about what they're going to do going forward. So thanks again, guys, and I look forward to talking to you again later.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.